Hello, I'm here today with Anders Krohn, a former student of the Saïd Business School undergraduate program in economics and management, and now the head of an entrepreneurial venture, his own company called Aula. And he's here today to talk to me about his personal journey into entrepreneurship and the development of his company over that period of time. So thank you for coming to talk to me today, Anders.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
You left, 5 years ago?
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
See, time stretches when you're not
I think it's
involved.
3, yeah. I started in 2013 and left in 2015.
Okay, so you started as an undergraduate.
Yeah.
And you'd come from another undergraduate program to Oxford.
Yeah, I have a bit of a weird sort of background. I'm from Denmark and grew up there, lived there until I was 18 years old. Then I moved to the US, where I did like a gap year at one university in the rural south in the US. And then I moved back to Denmark, studied for a bit there, and then I got into Oxford and moved here. So I came here as a mature student, that is called. I was 21 when I started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly a little older than most undergraduates, but not a lot. Do you think it was significant that because you were a little older, the kinds of choices you made about what classes to take and what to do with your career might have been different than if you'd arrived here at the age of 18?
I definitely would. I generally recommend people to take time before they start university to get a bit of experience, because then you can it's easier to see how you can apply those things. So for example, I was a student worker at a big sort of insurance company for a year before I started, which was like a part-time job. And I definitely think that those things fed into how I thought about my degree.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously when you're 18 years old, coming straight from high school, that's a bit different.
Yeah. And I ask because one of the things we know about people who go into entrepreneurial ventures after their studies, they've often had a little taste of the real world. And either they didn't like it and they want to shape something for themselves, or they just loved the independence of it and they want to shape something for themselves. So it sounds like one of the things that's moved you into an entrepreneurial career was that taste of the real world before your studies.
Yeah, I think that and randomness, I think as well. I think I would lie if I said that it was something that I had always planned. I'd always been sort of relatively entrepreneurial, but actually it was one of my friends from my college who we started a venture together initially, and that's how I got into it. So when I arrived at Oxford, I was thinking about the sort of usual suspects of like consulting or doing a PhD or other things, and then suddenly I definitely got a taste for running my own startup.
So before we start talking about the startup and how you came up with the idea with your colleagues at the time, just a few more things about your early days as a student. So you were doing the same course as everybody else, general management and various other things. When did you first start thinking, I'm learning enough to know that I want to be an entrepreneur? Was that after a year into the more evolved part of the studies?
We started the company during the sort of towards the end of my first year, and we were actually part of an accelerator that was at Saïd Business School at that point called the Lean Launchpad, which is when I started to get a taste for how it is to sort of apply some of the things that I had been studying. And I think what was quite unique, and now that something I definitely think a lot about now in terms of how to choose a degree, I think one thing that was quite unique about studying here was that you could find sort of all the great people to do things with next to your studies, but the sort of academic stuff is quite rigorous, I find, compared to other business schools. Like it's very like focused on academic literature and things that are not necessarily textbook based and other things. And I definitely think that the combination of those fundamentals and understanding that theory is actually quite a lot more useful than I had initially thought now, where in sort of my current role. And I think another thing is that I think a lot about at the moment is that actually most of the things that I learned here that are the most useful are things that are the ones that are known to be the most fluffy. I think that's definitely one thing that actually when you start managing, well in our case it's not a massive company but 18 people, is actually the psychology and the sort of theories of competitive advantage and these sort of things, and communicating that to people, that's more important than say accounting or finance, at least from my perspective. And obviously that varies from company to company, but I think there was that background that was has been really helpful.
That's good to hear, and that's sort of what I was getting towards, that having some sense of maturity or experience that you can combine with your theoretical studies to see not just the relevance of the theoretical studies, but how you apply them and what matters most. Certainly the undergraduate program here in management at the Side Business School is not practical. It's an academic thing. It's not a degree like you would get in many other universities where we really teach you how to start a business. But people do start businesses in this context, and it's because they're thoughtful and, we hope, well supported. So you mentioned the Lean Startup Initiative. That was a type of support the school does. Tell us a bit about that and any other things like that you used to develop your ideas while you were here.
Yeah, I think that was basically, I think it was a 4 or 8 week program where people who had a business idea were brought together, and then they would walk through like different processes for like how to think about a startup, how to develop a value proposition, how to talk with customers. And when we started, what was back then called UBlend, we were completely clueless. Like we had like no idea. Like and now where we've sort of corrected all those things with like legal fees and all sort of other like those mistakes, it's clear that it was an important catalyst to have something next to the academic studies to actually get onto that journey, I think. And it sounds like that's something that the school has developed quite a lot in the last 3 years. And I think for me, that's what's really unique about, well, Side Business School, but also Oxford in general, is that you get the sort of academic fundamentals to actually, I think at a quite young age, take on a lot of responsibilities and think a lot about like how to present arguments and all the sort of things that are needed to run a company. And then a lot of the practical experience comes increasingly from the school and other societies and other things being able to sort of provide catalysts that are next to the academic studies. But I think the fundamentals are essential. I think and that's also something we look a lot for when we recruit people, and we look at a lot of sort of very successful entrepreneurs, people like Reid Hoffman, Stuart Butterfield. They are philosophers, right? They're not necessarily sort of traditional management background, and I think Side Business School is good at providing those fundamentals to actually get people out there who know how to think sort of logically about how to solve problems.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we're striving for. But we realize that it's so important to also provide this para-curricular, around the curriculum support, and that, as you say, has evolved a lot over the past few years. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's go back to you. So you started the business at the end of your first year, and it had a different name and a different business model at the time. So tell us about how it started.
So we started out basically, and I was not the one who had the initial idea. It was my good friend Jean, and basically what we created back then was an events platform for universities, which worked sort of reasonably well. We raised some funding, we got out to like 12 universities, but then for sort of various reasons, we realized that was not going to be the type of company that we wanted to create. But at that point, we were sort of quite far down the journey. We had sort of a team around us and all the sort of things you need to start a business. And then we did a pretty radical pivot into what we're doing today, which is called Aula, which is a communication platform for educational institutions. And I think that entire journey has been, well, partly I think some of the perseverance comes from studying here, like actually thinking like logically about problems, having worked in what is usually like quite an intense environment, I think also helped. And then there are sort of various randomness and timing reasons that meant that we changed direction and do what we're doing today.
But you were equipped to pivot. Why do you think you were able to pivot the business model? That was your word, and it's such a good word. You had one business model and you turned into another. How long did that take? Did you feel like it was inevitable or necessary, or what was the experience of pivoting like?
So the process itself didn't take that long. Like once we had this, I think one thing that's important is like when you decide to pivot, you have to do it. You can't do sort of an in-between thing. And I think there's various degrees of pivots. Like you can pivot slightly, and in our case, we ended up basically sort of starting from scratch, which I think it was a combination of being sort of pushed away from the initial idea because some things were not working as we had hoped, and being drawn towards a new idea, which we got inspiration for because of what we had initially worked on. So we had a pretty good understanding of like how universities sort of operate and how sort of teaching works and how students engage with those things and how to build products for students, which we could then apply to what we thought was a quite exciting new idea, and then we just went for it.
And what was the kind of new elevator pitch? If when you've decided to pivot, you decided to pivot big, and now you're being asked, what's this new business that you're doing? How did you answer that question concisely?
Yeah, so what we're doing is essentially we help educational institutions increase student engagement. So when you walk into most educational establishments like this one, the way that teaching and learning works is still to a large extent very focused on sort of static content. And obviously at Oxford, the conversations are an important piece of that. But at a lot of educational institutions, it is very much sort of a one-way thing. And so what happened at that point was a lot of chat-based applications were really taking off, like Slack, Microsoft Teams, Facebook Messenger, WeChat, and others. And we decided, okay, actually, maybe what we can do is we can use those chat-based technologies to completely rethink the way that digital infrastructure works, like in education. So that we went out, we worked with 200 professors, 30 universities to build out what was initially the sort of the initial product, and then we worked on that for a year, and then we signed our first universities.
And so now you've gone from that strength to many more strengths. What's the extent of your involvement now in terms of numbers of universities that you're working with?
So we have the first university that's rolling it out to all their courses now over the summer, and we're working with 8 universities and a high school for refugees, and we've just closed seed funding now 2 months ago. Of which has allowed us to basically build out the team, hire more engineers, customer success, CEO, and like all the sort of things that are in a more mature business, but it's still a very sort of early stage startup. But definitely my role is different now compared to sort of when we sort of initially started out, where you sort of start out as like the foot soldier, and now obviously there's a lot more overhead and sort of managerial stuff.
And so you mentioned funding. To the extent that you're able to talk about it, there have been several rounds of funding that you've had to go through. Just tell us sort of basically what that journey has been from beginning to today.
Yeah, so we just started out with the initial idea, we raised a bit of what's called angel investment, so from private individuals, about like 100K. And then after we had done the pivot, we raised another round of angel investment of 400K, all from some really great angels and very successful entrepreneurs of billion-dollar companies. And now we just closed seed funding, which is more institutional, of $4 million. So now it's a bit more sort of serious money. And I think that has been in itself an interesting journey. And I think what has to sort of tied back to what I learned here, I think what E&M helped with was to give some of the basics around like finance, accounting, strategy theory. That definitely is a comparative advantage for someone who's pitching to an investor at a young age. Because I think one of the things that is quite often underestimated is how old the average entrepreneur is. And like a lot of universities, I think it's fantastic that a lot of universities take initiatives to sort of help people to start startups or work for startups. But sometimes there can even be a bit too much push, because actually most successful entrepreneurs are not that young. And I think being young and it being my first sort of company, I think some of the basics that I learned here have been absolutely essential in like how do you make a financial model when you ask someone for several million.
Do you have any opportunity to interact with the Foundry now that you're a super busy entrepreneur, like on your few moments of spare time when you return to Oxford?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in learning more about is what plans are in place. So you mentioned that a lot of these new initiatives draw in other faculties and other things. Like I think that's probably, from my perspective, one of the things that's hardest about starting a business, where actually universities are quite uniquely positioned to solve that problem, which is to bring people from different disciplines together. So I think that would be, which was partly there when I was there, but not as much as I think as one could have desired. So I think we'd be sort of curious to learn a bit more about that.
Well, the inside the curriculum, there'll be some opportunities through the classes I just described. The Entrepreneurship and Innovation course, which was originally designed for both engineering students and economics and management students. And then the business planning course will again also be drawing on people from different disciplines. And I think soon our plans are to admit people from still more subjects into both of those. there will then be tutorial support from the various contributing faculties so that the interests and perspectives of each type of student can be supported, but also mixed with the perspectives of their peers from other subjects. And that's a struggle. I mean, one reason why it doesn't happen very often is that it's hard to juggle all those different interests. But we're trying to be very intentional about it because its benefit is certain. I mean, as you say, the name of the game of an entrepreneurial team is diversity, and learning how to cope with that diversity while also expressing your own expertise is super important. And then other support mechanisms around the university, such as the Foundry, such as societies. I think seeing that the general drift is towards interdisciplinary teams.
And is that a demand from students, or is it an intention from the school?
Well, it's both. It's certainly a demand from students, but it's also a supply from the school, and we recognize and have eagerly encouraged students way beyond our normal reach. So particularly, for example, in the humanities, to get involved with entrepreneurship, because they have so much to offer. I mean, you mentioned philosophers like Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a better company for his humanistic background, and so we are very eager to as it were, preach the gospel or encourage the involvement of people from non-traditional sources of entrepreneurial talent. And I think what's interesting about your journey is that you started with a university-wide business opportunity or business model, that gave you visibility across the whole university, and then you've continued with a business model that's for a whole university, or has a holistic purpose. So you innately understand that. Yeah. Whereas other technologies might be too, focused in one particular area of engineering or science or whatever else.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that when I look at like friends who've both from Oxford and from elsewhere who are like successful, or at least have gotten some traction with their startups, it's definitely the ability to bring together people who have like different perspectives on things. One of my co-founders is a product designer, and the other one is an engineer, which is sort of like those. If you don't have that type of mix, or if you have an idea that's coming out of engineering or maths, like if you don't bring in operational expertise and other things, like it's just extremely hard. And I think those are the initiatives, both I think obviously from sort of being an alumni and also from some of the universities we're working with at Aula those are the ones that I'm happiest to see, is like the ones where the university we're uniquely positioned in society to bring these people together, because that's when you really have sort of the magic starts happening.
Well, you've gone on from the starting the business here, pivoting into a new business while you were still a student, and then committing yourself really fully to the business and building it. Raising the funds, and now you're operating out of London. Yeah, we have. So our engineers are in 6 different countries, but the sort of main team is in London, and we just hired our first person who will be sort of London and New York. Wow. Okay, I didn't know about that. That's exciting. Yeah, he joined last Monday, so it's still. Yeah. So the business is really growing fast, and do you find that the kinds of people you're recruiting are like we've described, people with university backgrounds, some understanding of the importance of pulling together diverse perspectives, but with solid grounding intellectually and experientially in what it means to be an entrepreneur? Yes, it's definitely, maybe I'm a bit biased there, but it's definitely some of the things that we're trying to look for in candidates. So it depends a bit on whether it's on the engineering side, where I think like it's not obvious always that university degrees are needed within all sort of areas of a business. In terms of how we recruit, for example, for the people who run our implementation teams and others, it's definitely very much looking for like those sort of fundamentals and like a diversity of disciplines and perspectives. So we have people who've studied economics, philosophy, worked for McKinsey. We have people who have a pedagogy background. We have people who have a change management background. We have people who have like philosophy backgrounds. And I think that is absolutely essential. And what they all have in common is
the ability to sort of think logically about problems, which I think is probably one of the most important things at the early stages. To stay disciplined and focused, you need to be able to sort of think like what are actually the problems we're trying to solve. So that's definitely something that we look for in the people who apply. And now we're starting to, I think, even from a sort of talent or employer brand, that sounds so corporate, but from an employer brand perspective, that's also really attractive. Like we're starting to get like candidates who look for exactly that mix of things. So now we're starting to have people who like say no to McKinsey or like leave Google, and like those are sort of the things that are great to see, because I think a lot of more mature companies have not necessarily cracked that nut sufficiently, and I think startups who think about that will be uniquely positioned to get the types of people who look for like the degrees or programs that you've started here. So.
Well, I think it's a true measure of success if you're starting to seduce people away from Google and McKinsey. That's something that I think any company should be proud of, especially in its first few years.
I think one thing that's worth noting on the topic of sort of global and international programs is that I think one of the things that E&M and probably Oxford in general gives people is a sort of global benchmark, which I think is something that's absolutely essential for, at least in the sort of technology space, depends on what type of business you're starting. But if you're starting a tech company, like having a global benchmark is essential for success, because you're dealing in like a global market from day one. And so being part of a group of students who've been doing well in like their different countries and then come together here has for me been essential for sort of comparing myself to the right things, I think. And I think their E&M is like fantastic, because you just get to know like what's out there. Whereas if you study in a sort of less international cohort or less diverse cohort, then you don't really get the same perspectives.
Or it's artificial. The MBA program, similarly to E&M, is diverse, but even more so. And in fact, recently the MBA program has crossed certain barriers that most MBA programs find really hard to cross. Like, for example, there's a little more than 40% of the class are women, and the average for most MBA programs is much lower, like 33%. So in international diversity, the MBA program is, I would guess, one of the most diverse degrees in the university. And they reflect in some ways the intentions of the school as a whole to create that global perspective for any kind of students. And that, as you say, is so important. Now, it doesn't come easy, all this hard work. So you've been working constantly. I doubt you've taken a vacation for yourself in all this 3-5 years you've been at it. But tell us more about what you feel keeps you going. What's your source of energy to commit so much to this full-on activity?
I think there's two things. Like, one is about the sort of problem itself. So I'm very interested in education. I'm interested in how people learn, and getting the opportunity to actually work with higher education leaders on thinking about how can you make universities or other educational institutions significantly better, and how can you use technology to solve their problems. I think I'm drawn towards the problem. What I'm also drawn towards, this sounds a bit cliche, but the people. I think that's what's also exciting when it's getting tough, is to have the right people around you, and to be able to work with people who are smarter than yourself and have diverse perspective and all those sort of things to solve problems. I think is super exciting, and I really like the idea of sort of trying to sort of build an organization from scratch. Is that it's you get to be a rebel in some areas. Like, you get, so for example, we, as I mentioned before, we have what's called a distributed team, right? So for engineers, we recruit everywhere in the world, which means that our office is essentially a digital office, right? Like, some of the things that it's not really captured in management theory, for example, but then you get to think about, like, what are the things that I've learned here that can then be applied into the sort of bleeding cutting edge of what it means to run an organization. I think that's, for me at least, is quite exciting.
But that sustains you through the really tough times. I mean, have you had some bumps in the road that you've had to deal with, or are there things
a lot,
or are there things that you feel that you've had to sacrifice in order to keep the right level of attention and pressure on the task?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we're still at a stage where it's still like very early days for us, right? So like there's still bumps in the road almost every day and things that can go completely wrong. I think in terms of on the more sort of personal side of things, it was, so when I went on leave from Oxford to sort of, and then we pivoted basically. I think that period was quite tough, like, you know, like living in London, not having that much money, you don't really know if the world wants what you're building. I think that was quite intense.
But you made it through that. You feel you're through the other side of that. That period of sacrifice and uncertainty came to an end, and now you're in a more positive position?
Yeah, I think now it's different types of problems, I think, like hiring, firing, promoting, those sort of things, but which are still extremely intense and require a lot of work. But I think the sort of very early days of a startup where you have just had an idea and you're trying to put it into the world, that's tough sometimes.
That's tough, yeah. And we certainly think a lot of people understand that intellectually but not emotionally, and and you know, being able to hear from entrepreneurs who've gone through it or experienced it somehow firsthand is one of the things that students most value when they're trying to make that decision, and it's one of the things that universities and educational environments find hard to recreate unless they can get help from people like you to come back and tell current students, as a former student,
what does it feel like?
What does it feel like?
Yeah.
You know, people learn a lot more from role models than from books, and I think the school is trying to create as many opportunities for role models, mentors, former students, alumni, entrepreneurs to come and help show current students and future students what it's really like. Okay, so if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself about how to get where you are today?
I think in terms of getting the most out of being here, I would definitely say to sort of branch out. Like, and I don't think I did that enough. Like, to actually find ways to sort of go a bit outside of the comfort zone and meet people who are not like yourself. I think taking advantage of, when you look back, you always wish you had sort of taken more advantage of the type of community that exists here at Oxford. And that's sort of how I feel about it as well. I think also in terms of trying to find ways to maybe sort of, also from an academic perspective, just to see what's out there, right? I think that's one of the things that maybe some American universities do a lot, right, in terms of like liberal arts like things. And actually Oxford offers those opportunities, but students are quite often sort of stick within their sort of own curriculum, and I wish sometimes that I'd actually done that a bit more. And I think initiatives like the courses here where people from other departments can come to those courses, I think are great for the university as a whole, because that's probably one of the things that I wish I had done a bit more of, to see what academic disciplines are out there, what people are out there, and not just sort of stick to the cohort or the college.
Yeah. And in terms of the business developing, are there specific things or maybe common pitfalls that you now see you fell into yourself that, if you, with the benefit of the hindsight, you could advise yourself not to do? Does anything spring to mind?
I think one thing is to be a bit more patient in terms of finding the right advisors. Like, it's at the sort of very early stage, you have to obviously move fast because you need to sort of see if things work. But I think if you're starting a company during your degree or just after your degree, it's important to sort of find someone who's either done it before or someone who's seen, just to avoid like the completely obvious mistakes, like not writing the right contracts or not finding the right domain name or not recruiting the right way or whatever it might be. I think those are some of the things where we definitely added like quite a few months, if not years, to our journey. And that it's part of it, I think. But I think what is great about things like the Foundry and other things is if that's coupled with mentorship, then you can solve some of those problems. And we partly got that when we initially started out, but we still made some things that are now pretty sort of obvious mistakes. And I think there's a huge opportunity as well for the school and thinking more about how can current students be sort of paired with alumni, either through sort of initiatives like inviting people in or other types of ways to get them more practical knowledge.
Well, it's great that you can smile about some of the mistakes now, but it's more great, of course, that you've made it through and learned from that process. We certainly know that people learn as much from doing as they do from listening, and the entrepreneurial education we're striving to provide here at the Oxford Side Business School is a combination of theoretical and practical. And you're an impressive exemplar of the fact that it's working well. So thank you very much, Anders, for coming to talk to us today about your own entrepreneurial journey and that of your company, Aula. And we look forward to seeing what entrepreneurs follow in your footsteps.
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thanks again.